Welcome to the From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market podcast with your host, Phil Crowley. In each episode, we will discuss professionals serving the tech startup market and the various issues of importance to those companies. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, CrowleyLawLLC.com. Now here's the host of From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market, Phil Crowley.
Welcome, and thanks for tuning into our podcast. We always try to bring on the podcast executives who are experienced in the biotech and technology areas and people who support those executives and those companies to share their experience with you right from the front lines. Today, I'm pleased to have with us Walter Greenblat, who's the managing director of Walter Greenblat and Associates, which is an investment banking firm which is focused on biotech investing. And over the past decade and more, Walter and his group have been one of the most prolific and dedicated financiers for early stage biotech companies. Walter is not only an investor and investment banker, but he's had experience also as an entrepreneur, running his own company and bringing it to more than 100 employees before he sold it off. Walter, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Walter, you have had a very distinguished academic career. Yale undergraduate, Harvard Business School with distinction. You went to Oxford to get a master's degree in economics. After that, you went to Bain Company, had your own company and sold it. And then, many people would go to Hawaii, sit on the beach and just enjoy what they had accomplished. And you decided to jump into biotech investing, which is not for the faint of heart. Could you tell me what inspired you to do that?
Well, I think in many ways it was a continuation of what you just described. It's a great way to get an education, not always an easy education. I say education is always expensive one way or the other. And I've always enjoyed learning things. And that's why I've really enjoyed my education. But I've always enjoyed entrepreneuring, and this is a great combination of the two of them. So that's, I think, how I got into it. Is I love hearing from people who are inventing and thinking about new things, and that's the life science. I happened to be living in Princeton, New Jersey at the time, and when I sold a business that I'd started and run for about 10 years after I left Bain Company, and the area is very full of life science companies, and it was an opportunity I met a bunch of people, and they said, if you do this, there's a lot of work to be done, and I took them up on it.
Well, that's super. You have, and your expertise is something like pulling back the curtain for our audience of people who typically are not financiers, who may be looking for financing, and they always wonder, well, how do I introduce myself, present myself to investment bankers and venture capitalists and angel investors? Could you go through with us a little bit of, what is your thinking process as you look at a potential biotech investment? What are the kind of things that you look for to be potential key areas of strength, or the things that turn you off and make you say, well, I'm not going to invest in that?
Yeah. So the first thing is to hear a story that makes sense from somebody. You hear somebody explaining, we're developing I'll give you some real examples. We're developing a therapeutic that targets solid tumor cancers that have been extremely difficult to treat. The reason that we're targeting them better is for this for this precise reason, and here's the evidence for it, and here's why we think it's going to make a major difference in meeting an unmet medical need. And the first thing I realize when I hear that is I don't have the expertise to evaluate those claims myself.
Right.
And it's not because I haven't been doing this for a long time, but because I have, but because there's so much to know within a specific area, especially in biology. It's a very, the old joke is that in chemistry, if you know one molecule, you kind of know them all. And if in biology, if you know the left kidney perfectly, you don't know anything about the right kidney. And so that's part of why we need to go to people who have domain expertise. So for the example I just gave, I would go to somebody in my network who is really an expert in oncology, and say, will you listen to this story that Dr. Hellenbeck is telling, and tell me whether this makes sense to you, and what questions would you ask? What papers would you like to read? So, and that's been a really good way. We call that our testing the waters process. We don't engage with somebody until we've actually had them present to some of the investors within our network that we know have domain expertise, and have those people ask their questions and say, those answers were good answers. This is really interesting.
So they have to, I'm sorry, but so they have to have really solid science to get through the gate.
Solid science that passed the test with somebody that knows more of the science than I do, or my colleagues, even though in one case one of them's an MD, but nonetheless, that we're going to go to somebody who knows more and have them explain it, and has the science, and has intellect, usually has a patent portfolio or something that protects that science, so that we're not working on things that's not entirely true. There have been some exceptions to that where there are companies that are more commercial and not so much IP focused, but by and large, they're companies that have a very strong patent estate.
So that they can then exclude others from competing with that.
Right. So if they prove that it works, they've really got some protection to develop it, because it takes years. These things take 5 to 10 years and sometimes longer to gestate.
Right. Now, someone comes to you with a great scientific idea, but it's great to do something in a petri dish. It's quite a different thing to be in a human, and before you get to humans, you typically have to have some animal models. Is that the phase where you invest, or do you invest if you have a solid science and you're willing to roll the dice on whether or not it would work in animal systems, at least?
Well, it depends a lot on the kind of product and so forth. We do, and I should just clarify that we do invest. I do invest personally in these deals, but we're not primarily we're not a fund, so we don't invest. We're one of many angel investors when it's an angel investment that come into these things. We're primarily serving as an intermediary to go out to others. We only work on things that we'll invest in ourselves, but that's not going to be enough to get the company. And we talk about those things as sort of a series of stages. If it's a biotech deal, it's going to have an in vitro phase, an in vivo phase where you're doing the animal proof of concept. That will lead into a phase where you do human proof of concept, and then finally to the point of getting approval and getting something commercialized. And that's a very long process. That's a 10-year process. We have worked on companies that were at the in vitro stage where they just had some interesting science and some ideas, and raised the money to drive the company through the in vivo stage where you have animal proof of concept. And given how complicated biology is, as we already discussed, something that works in a petri dish or a test tube is going to be much more challenged by a rodent model or a pig model or whatever it may be. But to fund the company through that, and then that's a value inflection point. If you prove that works, that it not only works in vitro in the test tube, but in vivo in an animal system, then to go into human clinical studies. And that's a series of value inflection points for the company. And usually our financings are phased to those value inflection points. So there would be a first and generally we do a series of financings for a company. So the first one might be enough to get to, they've got some good in vitro evidence, enough to get them to conduct the key proof of concept in animals, maybe and sometimes that's enough to sell a company on and get an exit. There's one example where we raised $4.6 million for a company, and it proved very, very kind of definitively that it worked in the generally accepted rat model for Pompe disease. And that was sufficient to get the company sold. But usually that's enough to get the company financed to the next stage, which would be, okay, now you've got in vivo efficacy, you're going to finance, and maybe that takes $3 or $4 million to do all in. The next phase, getting the human proof of concept, is going to probably take 10 or $15 million. Right. And you don't want to sort of build half a bridge. You don't want to raise enough money to kind of just get the IND, but not actually do the study. So when you raise more money, you haven't proved very much. You want to get to you ideally raise enough money so that the people who come in at a lower valuation, because the key thing that you're trying to prove hasn't been proved yet, when it comes to the end of their financing, you will have proved that. Let's say human proof of concept that it works, that this drug works to address the problem in a human patient. That's going to be a huge increase in value for the investors and might make it much easier to raise the next round. So it's kind of like building a bridge across a very wide river that's in a very counterintuitive way, which build each span of the bridge to the next pier and not ever go across because it's too expensive to go all the way across.
Right, I see. Well, so that what we're telling investors to expect, that funding is really incremental to get to inflection points where you have proven another element of the evidence that you'll need to present to FDA to get approval for the drug. That impresses me as a difference between experienced biotech investors like you and the climate in 2021 and 2022, when we saw great amounts of money, $50-60 million thrown at companies very early in their development program. And it turned out that the development program didn't work out. And it seems to me that your program of taking financings in incremental steps and requiring the invested company to meet some milestones is better for the investors. And it's something that should be cranked into the strategic thinking of the entrepreneurs to understand that that's actually the best way to move forward in terms of going forward.
Yeah, it's first of all, it's much better to get investors' attention, because a lot of times the entrepreneur is thinking, how much do I need to get the next few things done that I want to get done? Which is very different to how much do I need to get to the next point that gives some kind of a return, even if it's only on paper so far, to the investor. And it's a completely different mindset. I need to spend $2 million to create a clinical batch, or to create a better working commercial prototype of a medical device or something like that. That doesn't in and of itself help the investor at all unless it gets far enough along. So yeah, but it also helps the company. It doesn't just help it helps the company, because it's going to be more meaningful to investors to talk about investing to a point where it's a milestone, but the reason that it's important that it's a milestone is also a value inflection point, which means the investor put in 1 and now it's worth 10. That's really important for investors, of course. And the other thing is that it means for the company that that the valuation you're selling for this little piece, you're not going to have to sell too much of your company. If you try to fund too far, if you don't fund far enough, you're going to have to raise more money, probably at a down round, to get to the value inflection point. And if you raise too much, you're going to be raising money that doesn't take into account of the fact that the company is worth a lot more money once you get past this inflection point, if you're funding to this one.
Right. Well, that kind of suggests that for our entrepreneurs out there that they should be doing their own due diligence on their investors to make sure that they're the kind of investors that understand the process of the sequential funding of their company, and also that they have some dry powder, so they have some additional funds to help the company in the event that and participate in additional rounds if the company is successful in getting to those milestones.
Right. And one other ingredient, which is patience. Because if you get a bunch of investors who are all focused on something near term and they don't understand that they're in for the long haul and it's going to be many, many years before there's an exit, most likely. Maybe it's possible that there'll be an exit right after the next inflection point, but the likelihood is that it takes a while, and you want people who aren't suddenly turning on you after a certain point and saying, I didn't understand what I was getting into. That's the other thing to make sure, because it's extremely helpful to have investors who are not. It may be taking a long time, but they're not surprised by that. They knew it.
Right. Well, Walter, at this point, I'd like to take just a brief break. I'd like to introduce our viewers and listeners to Crowley Law, our law firm. We are a law firm that is focused and passionate about helping life sciences and other technology entrepreneurs realize their dreams, to take great ideas from the laboratory bench to the patient's bedside, and from the garage to the marketplace, in order to improve the lives of thousands or even millions of people. I'm a former research physicist who decided that I wanted to have a little bit more immediate impact on people's lives and decided to follow a career in law. And as a former researcher, I know how hard it is to discover new knowledge. And then as a lawyer, I also appreciate how difficult it can be to take that new knowledge through the minefield that stands between the laboratory and the marketplace. And we are focused on protecting founders and innovators in that journey. I've heard many stories and have seen some stories of innovators who have not profited adequately from their own hard work as a result of choices that they made early in the process. So we're dedicated to helping those innovators make the right choices for them to protect their interests as they move these great ideas from the lab to the marketplace. So if you are an innovator with a great idea, please contact us. You can reach us at info@crowleylawllc.com. We also have a website, crowleylawllc.com, in which we have some free resources, including a book that some of my clients have said is very useful. It's called The Top 10 Causes of Failure for Technology Startups and How to Avoid Them. So I hope you'll obtain that book, read it, and send us a note at info@crowleylawllc if you enjoyed it. Thanks. And now returning to you, Walter. So we do have to do a bit of due diligence with our investors, but investors bring, like you, bring not only money, but a whole host, a network of people, advice, strategic advice and thinking. What are the sorts of benefits that intelligently selecting investors can give to an entrepreneur and to a company?
Well, I think you've touched on a lot of it. Someone who's got good judgment and a good network to help fill in things that are gaps in the company. Someone who's maybe been through it a few times. I think that can also be probably sometimes a little infuriating for a new investor and a new entrepreneur, in the sense that someone saying, that's not going to work, and and that's the whole point of entrepreneuring, is to come up with something that people didn't know could be done and do it. So there is some sort of an inherent tension between those things. But I think that the best entrepreneurs are really good at finding people who can give good coaching and taking it, and not always taking it. And that's that's where wisdom comes in, right? Is to know the difference between
Yeah.
good and bad advice. But I think what I think that can help extend what you were describing when you were talking about what you do, which is to try to help people get themselves positioned right up front, so they're protected, and some of the things that happen every time don't turn into calamities for them, because somebody who already has been through it, like you have, has helped them out. And I think you're doing that on the legal side. There are other people who can do that on the scientific side,
Mhm.
and which is why we like to have groups of investors that include pharmaceutical executives and people who are uh, steeped in the business, one aspect or another, people who know it, and that's something that investors certainly can do, and there's it's an ongoing investment. Some of these companies that get angel invested uh, end up with pretty good sized groups of people. In
Mhm.
one case, we've got over 150 investors in, and you don't necessarily want to be taking advice from all of them as you take all of the time. Not to mention that they don't all have good advice to offer you. There's just not
Yeah.
enough hours in the day for it, right? So it's got to be a sort of a kitchen cabinet kind of thing, or a real board of directors.
Right. Now, can you identify perhaps a few key elements of companies that are marked for success? What sorts of things do they tend to have that distinguish them from the companies that you wouldn't invest in? And conversely, can you point out some danger signs that you see that would cause you to shy away from investing in a particular company, so that our audience and innovators can kind of keep those things in mind?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a checklist exactly, but I mean, and some of it's it may be intuitive, but a, a certain kind of flexibility and nimbleness is really crucial in entrepreneuring generally, and particularly in early stage life science. A combination of kind of being both knowing the field and knowing your stuff, but
Mhm.
also not being so stuck that you can't make a change in response to what inevitably what you find out is things don't work out exactly the way you expected, and do you have the ability to make a small or a large pivot if needs be. And I think that's one thing. And
Mhm.
honestly, it's not something you necessarily find out about something right when you first meet them. So
Right.
you uh, uh, I find that out over time. Part of the reason for testing the waters is to go through a few series of things with people before before getting actually engaged with them.
Mhm.
I think that the thing that's the most that's the clearest kind of red flag about potential failure is when somebody is so uh, blinkered or blind, blindered is what
Mhm.
in terms of kind of tunnel vision about what they're doing, and not recognizing, poo-pooing competition, or saying,
Mhm.
oh, these guys are doing this, but they don't know what they're doing. These guys are, and a lot of times, I guess what used to be known as marketing myopia, which is not understanding kind of the full range of groups that you're competing with. And when someone's sounding like that, like they're so focused on their technology
Mhm.
and why it's the best, and all the other things that are trying to address that problem are, wastes of time, that makes me worry.
Right.
And
So,
so somebody who understands the competition and understands what aspects of them is formidable and what aspects isn't that they feel like they are dominant in, that's a happy sign.
I see. Also, I mean, in your initial example, you were speaking about addressing solid tumors in cancer. And everybody knows that cancer is a gigantic market. But let's take, for example, some other therapeutic area. What do you look for in a market analysis to help you understand how big the market is, whether these folks really understand the market and the dynamics of the marketplace? How does that work?
Well, so before we want to take on a project, we want to know that it has the potential for investors to get a 10 or a 20x return.
Mhm.
So that means you need to know a couple things. You need to know sort of how much money it's going to take in this current round, what the next few rounds are likely to look like, and what an exit might look like, which is a little different than the question you're asking, which is how big is the market? Because we're actually looking to get companies, for the most part, exiting before they get to the market. They're going to be likely going to be acquired by another company in med tech or biotech. I've had one client that IPO'd, and they were a company that was a revenue-based company, but by and large that's not true. So the question that we ask ourselves is, what's it going to take? What's it going to take to get to the point where there could be an exit? And that means looking at comparable companies and what kinds of exits they've had, what the payout has been. I mean, in the example that I gave you of a company where we got the in vivo results in rats and then sold the company, there was a very similar company that had been sold for an amount we negotiated exactly the same deal basically for their exit. And indeed, the investors have gotten a 10x return, but that was we knew in advance what we were trying to get to, and you very rarely do things come out exactly as planned. But it is important to know what the market size is and all that, because that is going to have a very important influence on how much someone might pay for a company. But by far more companies exit by acquisition than do by IPO.
Yes, I mean, having been on the other side of the table representing Johnson and Johnson for all those years, I know that the attractiveness of these small companies is very high for strategic buyers, because strategic buyers can accept a lower financial return, because what they're seeking to do is to take the product and put it in the fantastic machinery that they have to provide for marketing, sales, manufacture, quality control, regulatory affairs, all the things that go into having a successful, fully integrated pharmaceutical company, rather than have the small company try to build all that and take the risk of having that not work properly. And so having acquisition by a strategic partner really makes a lot of sense for many, if not most, of the smaller companies, at least those that I've seen who are my clients or potential clients.
Yeah. And by the way, that's something that I would say is a mark of potential success also, is that the entrepreneur has been thinking about who might buy it and developing those relationships for a long time, because they take years, from Johnson & Johnson.
Yes.
You probably are on a first name basis with the person who you're going to be working with on that acquisition deal several years before you're really talking about the deal, at least in my experience.
Right. Well, I see that also in your world as well, Walter, because my sense is that investment bankers and bankers generally like to have a relationship with the person before they invest, and having an entrepreneur come in and say, well, here's what we're working on, and we just wanted to let you know what we're doing, and then come back 6 months and said, well, we predicted 6 months ago we were going to do A, and now we've completed A successfully, and here's our plan for B, and then come back after a period of time and said, well, we actually got to B plus.
Right.
And so you have confidence, the bankers have confidence that the management team can deliver on its promises.
Yeah, a point well taken. And it's less so with clients coming to us, because we often start with companies before inception. And because they don't really have often don't have two nickels to rub together when we start. I mean, we've got to build something up. But when we're going to investors, that's right. We want to be able to say, the people we go to first, and they're not all going to invest, but at least we want to make sure that they're warmed up so that they recognize success when they see it 6 or 12 months later. That's all. Right. That's a crucial part of the process.
Super. Well, Walter, this has been a wonderful conversation. I don't know where all the time has gone, but
yeah,
thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It's so valuable to hear from biotech investors how they see these particular investment opportunities, what they're looking for, and the activities and characteristics that entrepreneurs can put in place to make themselves more attractive potential investees. So thank you again for joining us. That's our podcast for today. And if you have enjoyed it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for our channel. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Appreciate it.
You've been tuning into the From Lab to Patient, Garage to Market podcast with your host, Phil Crowley. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, CrowleyLawLLC.com. If you found this information helpful, please subscribe, like, leave a positive review, and share with others.